Something is rotting in the Tiber, not fish grain. A barge has capsized near the docks at Emporium, and the swollen sacks are bobbing in the current while dock workers scream at each other in 3 languages. 2 miles away, in the Subura district, a woman is standing in a queue before dawn has broken, waiting for her grain ration, the portion that will determine whether her family eats today. She does not know about the capsized barge. She does not need to know. The system will compensate. The system always compensates. Because Rome, at its height, had built something that no city before it had ever attempted, and no city for 1,000 years after it would match. A logistical network capable of feeding 1 million people every single day, without interruption, without refrigeration, without motorized transport, without a single warehouse scanner or shipping manifest that did not rely on a human being writing it by hand onto a wax tablet. This is not a story about abundance. Rome was not a naturally generous place. The Italian peninsula is not flat. The soil is not endlessly fertile. The rivers are not gentle. The genius of Rome was not that it sat in the middle of plenty. The genius of Rome was that it built the machinery to move plenty to where it was needed, and then it scaled that machinery to a size the ancient world had never seen. Here is the misconception that almost everyone carries about ancient Rome, that its citizens were well fed because the empire was rich. The truth is almost the reverse. Rome's citizens were well fed because Rome was terrified. Terrified of what happens when 1 million hungry people share a city with too few soldiers and too many knives. Before the great grain system existed, before Egypt was conquered, before Ostia was built into a proper harbour, before the Annona became an institution, Rome was a mid-sized Italian city that nearly starved on multiple occasions. In 440 BCE, a famine struck so severely that, according to the historian Livy, bodies were found floating in the Tiber, and the city seriously considered evacuation. This was not an anomaly. It was a recurring condition. Grain shortages triggered riots. Grain riots toppled politicians. Politicians who solved grain shortages became gods. The entire trajectory of Roman political history, from the Gracchi brothers to Julius Caesar to Augustus, runs through the question of who controls the food. And so when Augustus became the first emperor in 27 BCE, the food supply was not merely an agricultural matter. It was the foundation of political legitimacy itself. To hold power in Rome was, first and foremost, to keep Rome fed. Everything else followed from that. The first pillar of Rome's feeding machine was geography, specifically the conquest of the right geography. Egypt fell to Rome in 30 BCE, and the Nile Delta, with its impossibly fertile floodplains, became the empire's primary grain factory. Modern archaeologists estimate that Egypt alone supplied somewhere between 135,000 and 200,000 tons of grain to Rome per year. North Africa, modern Tunisia and Libya, contributed perhaps another 200,000 tons. Sicily and Sardinia added more. At its height, Rome was importing grain from a crescent of territory spanning more than 3,000 kilometers of coastline. No city anywhere in the ancient world had ever built a food supply chain on that scale. But geography alone does not feed a city. The grain had to move. The second pillar was the port of Ostia and its successor, Portus, the harbour that the Emperor Claudius began cutting from the sea itself in 41 CE. This is where the scale of Roman ambition becomes almost incomprehensible. Claudius ordered the construction of an artificial harbour basin at the mouth of the Tiber. 2 curved jetties of concrete reaching into the open sea, creating a protected anchorage for the Alexandrian grain fleet. His successor Trajan later added a hexagonal inner basin, 39 acres of still water connected to the Tiber by canal, that could shelter up to 200 ships at once. The Trajan basin at Portus was not merely an engineering achievement. It was a statement about what Rome believed it deserved. A dedicated port, larger than many ancient cities, whose sole purpose was the management of food. From Portus, the grain moved upriver. Smaller, flat-bottomed barges, the naves Cordicarii, hauled it 20 miles along the Tiber to the Emporium district, the great commercial wharf on the southern bank of the city. Dock workers unloaded the sacks, inspectors weighed them, customs officers logged them, merchants negotiated their cut, and then the grain moved into the third pillar of the system, the Horrea. The Horrea were Rome's warehouses, dozens of them, perhaps more than 290 by some ancient counts, ranging in scale from neighbourhood storage rooms to the Horrea Galbae, a riverside complex whose remains still stand in Rome today and which, at its peak, covered more than 22,000 square metres. The Galbae alone could hold tens of thousands of tons of grain, olive oil and wine in sealed, ventilated, fire-resistant rooms stacked several stories high. Walking through the Horrea Galbae was like walking through a small city of its own. A city made entirely of storage, staffed by freedmen, slaves and imperial agents who managed the inventories with a bureaucratic precision that would not look out of place in a modern logistics centre. The fourth pillar was the most radical, the Annona. This was the Roman state's direct intervention in the food supply, a system of subsidized and eventually free grain distributed monthly to a registered list of Roman male citizens. Julius Caesar found the list at somewhere around 320,000 recipients and cut it back to 150,000. Augustus reorganized it further. By the imperial period, the Annona was managed by a dedicated government official, the Praefectus Annonae, who commanded a staff of inspectors, administrators and enforcers spread across the empire's grain provinces. The prefect's office tracked harvests in Egypt, monitored shipping routes through the Mediterranean, set prices during shortages, and organized emergency purchases when the harvest failed. It was, in all but name, a ministry of food. A Roman male citizen on the grain dole received approximately 33 kilograms of wheat per month, enough to produce a surplus, enough to feed a small household if managed carefully. He did not receive bread. He received grain, which he either ground himself, paid a miller to grind, or purchased as finished bread from one of the city's several hundred bakeries, the pistrina, whose millstones were often turned by donkeys walking in endless circles in the bakery courtyard. The Roman baking industry was not artisanal. It was industrial. By the 4th century, Rome had at least 254 registered bakeries, each operating essentially as a processing plant converting state grain into the staple that the city consumed by the ton every single day. The fifth and final pillar was invisible to most ancient sources precisely because it was everywhere: the street-level food economy. Rome had no kitchens in most of its residential buildings. The insulae, the towering apartment blocks, housing the majority of the city's population, were fire traps, and open cooking fires in upper-floor apartments were a near guarantee of catastrophe. So Romans ate outside. They ate at the Thermopolia, the fast food counters that dotted every neighborhood, whose stone surfaces, fitted with ceramic vessels sunk into them for keeping food warm, have been excavated in extraordinary numbers at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and in Rome itself. They bought bread at the bakery door. They bought sausage from street vendors. They bought wine diluted with water at the popina, the tavern, the snack bar on the corner. The street food culture of Rome was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. It was how the daily caloric requirements of 1 million bodies were actually met meal by meal, in the cramped alleyways of one of history's most densely populated cities. At its peak, under the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, this system worked with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. Grain ships left Alexandria after the annual Nile flood, loaded with hundreds of tons of wheat, and arrived at Portus within 2 weeks on a favourable wind. Inspectors met them at the dock. Barges took the grain upriver within hours. The Horrea received it within days. The grain dole was distributed monthly, without exception. The bakeries opened before dawn. The Thermopylae lit their fires at midday, and 1 million people in a city without refrigerators, without supermarkets, without anything resembling a modern food safety authority, were fed. Here is where the paradox lives. The system that sustained Rome was also the system that made Rome impossible to sustain. Every grain ship that docked at Portus was a ship that had to have left Alexandria, which meant every storm season was a crisis in waiting. In 51 CE, the Emperor Claudius stood before a mob in the Roman Forum as they pelted him with stale crusts of bread, screaming that there were only 15 days of grain left in the city's warehouses. Claudius, the emperor of the known world, was nearly lynched over a supply chain disruption. He survived. He immediately launched the construction program at Portus, understanding with perfect clarity that his life depended on the grain arriving on time. The dependence was structural. A city of 1 million people consumes approximately 200,000 tons of grain per year. The Italian countryside cannot produce that. It had never been able to produce that. The growth of Rome from a mid-sized Italian city to the largest metropolis in the Western world had only been possible because the empire kept expanding, kept conquering new breadbaskets, kept bringing new agricultural surpluses into the tributary system that fed the capital. The moment the empire stopped expanding, the food supply peaked. The moment the empire began to contract, losing provinces, losing revenue, losing the political will to maintain the infrastructure at Portus and the fleet routes across the Mediterranean, the system began slowly to fail. The 3rd century CE nearly destroyed Rome twice over, without a single barbarian setting foot inside the walls. The crisis of the 3rd century, that 50-year convulsion of military coups, currency debasement, and near-constant civil war between 235 and 284 CE, shattered the administrative coherence of the Annona. Prefects changed with every new emperor. Shipping contracts were broken. The tax revenues that paid the grain shipments from Egypt became unreliable as the currency inflated and provincial governors stopped remitting funds to Rome. The city did not starve, not yet, but the seams of the system were beginning to show. When the Emperor Constantine moved the imperial capital to Constantinople in 330 CE, it was not merely a political gesture. It was a redirection of the supply chain. The grain fleets from Egypt were rerouted east. Rome's population, deprived of the political and financial infrastructure that had sustained it, began a decline that would prove irreversible. By 400 CE, Rome's population had fallen to perhaps 400,000. By 500 CE, after the Visigoth sack of 410, the Vandal sack of 455, the final deposition of the Western Emperor in 476, it had collapsed to somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000. The Horrea stood empty, the Thermopolia closed, the bakeries went dark. The great hexagonal basin at Portus silted up, its maintenance abandoned, its 39 acres of still water shrinking year by year under the weight of the Tiber's mud. The population of Rome would not reach 1 million again for 14 centuries. But something survived. Not the buildings. Most of those fell or were quarried for their stone. Not the institutions. The Annona dissolved. The Praefectus Annonae became a memory. The grain dole vanished with the empire. What survived was the knowledge. The knowledge that a city could be fed at industrial scale if the infrastructure existed to move food across water and road. The knowledge that state intervention in food supply was not charity but political necessity. The knowledge that a port was not merely a place for ships. It was the stomach of civilization. Medieval market towns inherited Rome's market logic. The guild system that organized European bakers, millers, and merchants for centuries was a direct institutional descendant of Rome's collegii. The professional associations that the state had licensed and regulated to manage the food trade. The great port cities of the medieval and early modern world, Venice, Genoa, Amsterdam, London, were all working from the same underlying insight that Rome had arrived at in the 1st century CE. Control the supply chain and you control the city. Every modern supermarket is, at its core, a descendant of the Roman Horrea, a climate-controlled warehouse distributed through a city's neighborhoods, containing food that was grown somewhere else, moved across water and road, and sold to urban populations who cannot feed themselves from the land beneath their feet. The scale is different, the technology is unrecognizable, but the logic is identical. Rome did not simply feed a city. In learning to move grain across oceans, rivers, and roads, it built the infrastructure of civilization itself, and every supply chain, every port, every market that followed is in some way still living inside its inheritance.